Hello, thank you for stopping by my YouTube channel, Tom's Datsun Garage. My hopes is that this channel serves as a documentary on the restoration of my 1971 Datsun 240Z. I also hope it's informative to anybody else who's embarking on their own restoration or even slight modification of the same car. I took this car apart 10 years ago, and I still have a ways to go. But I've passed a turning point. June 8th, 2019, this car came back from the body shop looking exactly like you see it. So now, everything that I bolt back to the car has to look brand new. If it doesn't look brand new, then it's going to stand out and look terrible, like an eyesore. So I have to be really careful when I put this car back together. And part of that journey is going to be having my bolts and brackets replated so that they look brand new. The things that came off the car are in relatively excellent shape. The car's got 68,000 original miles on it, and it was garage kept since it was new, or so at least I was told by the person I bought it from, which was the original owner's nephew. If you'd like a little trip, if you will, into the past to see how I got to this point, well, take a look. In late fall 2002, I was on eBay just kind of cruising around different listings and came across this 240Z. These are the exact photos from that listing. This is the first time I had seen my 240Z. I saved these photos to the hard drive, and out of curiosity, I followed the progress of the eBay listing, and the auction winded up ending in a no sale. I used the email link from the listing after the no sale and got in touch with the owner of the car. His name is Mike, and he lived in Savannah, Georgia. The car belonged to his uncle. His uncle had purchased the car brand new from Langley Datsun in Jacksonville, Florida, and kept it in the garage and drove it mainly on the weekends and just around to the beach and maybe a few errands here or there. The car had 48,000 original miles on it. He had mentioned that the car had been in a slight fender bender on the passenger front, and the car was repainted in the color you see it. It's slightly lighter shade than what the factory put on the car, and I wind up finding out later on it pretty much matched a Corvette color from the mid-60s. After about a month or so, a deal was finally struck, and I went to pick the car up in Georgia. Mike was sad to see the car go, but he knew it was going to go to a good owner who would love it and appreciate it. I gassed the car up just down the street from the house, and a little bit later during lunch, I put air in the tires on the way home. And as soon as I got home, I didn't even go in the house. I grabbed the wheels and tires that I had ready for the car and put them on as soon as I pulled up in the driveway. The car stayed in this configuration until 2005 and showed very well. I took home a trophy the following month in December of 2002. I drove the Z around quite a bit and enjoyed it for what it was, and even had the car show up in an advertisement that was used for the Z shop that I was working at the time, as seen here, and featured in a newsreel short for the 35th anniversary Nissan 350Z. With the exception of the wheels, the car was still completely bone stock. So, in February 2005, I installed the triple Mikuni carburetors on a Datsun competition intake manifold, as well as a Motorsport Auto 3-in-2 collector header and twice pipes exhaust. The car ran and sounded amazing, even though it still had the automatic transmission in it. It still sounded and ran great, and I loved it. And apparently so did the judges at the car shows that I entered. Then, finally, I decided to change the looks up a little bit. In June 2006, I decided to install a real, genuine, new old stock Z432 grille and drove the car for a few months until November of 2006, when in November I decided to pull off the bumper overriders on the front and rear of the car as well to give it a cleaner overall appearance and make it look closer to a Z432. And in March 2007, I installed a front and rear Motorsport Auto large sway bar kit, as well as the 10mm shorter quick steer steering knuckles so that I could have a faster steering ratio. And then right after that, I installed newly refurbished 14x7 zero offset Inky 92 wheels with brand new BF Goodrich tires. These looked really good on the car, and they rode okay, but they were bent axially, which means I was never able to get them to ride completely smooth. And it gave the car a really good look, like an early 80s modded Z vibe, but it just wasn't smooth enough for my tastes at higher speeds. I decided next to take out the automatic transmission and finally convert it over to a 5-speed manual. I installed the clutch pedal assembly and the clutch master assembly first before moving on to the transmission. The transmission was out of a 78 280Z, and the flywheel was an aluminum Fidanza flywheel, and the center force stage 2 clutch was installed at the same time. Installation for the most part was extremely straightforward and went pretty easily. The only real trouble I had was when I put the Motorsport Auto the short throw shifter onto the transmission. I had to do some slight modification of it, and aside from a short detour and having the stick itself re-welded once, it wound up fitting and working great all the way until I stopped driving the car. That was in April 2007. Then in February 2008, I installed an E31 cylinder head and a hotter camshaft, and I retuned the carburetors to match the new camshaft and cylinder head that slightly upped the compression to give me a little more power. The final modification I would make to the car was I would finally install 14x7 zero offset brand new Koenig rewind wheels, which kind of look like knockoff wheels of what I actually want on the car, which is the Watanabe Type Rs. Now this took care of the vibration at high speed problem, as these wheels were true and straight. I only took the car to the drag strips only once, and that was February 2009, where I ran a best time of 15.6. Fun fact about this picture right here is that the starter went bad and I had to go source a new starter the next weekend. So to get home that night, I had to push start the car and drive home, which was no problem. The last road trip the car ever made was to Brazelton, Georgia in May of 2010 for the MIDI event. I met John Morton, Peter Brock, and the BRE team, and it was a bucket list event, but these are the only two pictures I have of my car at that event, including this picture here with it on the track. I hit 110 miles an hour on the straight that day. It was truly a dream come true to drive my 240Z on that track where John Morton did and won the championship all those years ago. Throughout the years, I kept a very close eye on the car and every imperfection that it had, including some of the tiny little rust spots that started to appear. The biggest they had gotten was like the head of a pencil eraser. I kept an eye on body seams and any other place where rust may pop up. I never let it get too bad, and that was one of the driving forces between me wanting to restore this car at some point. I could just see a little bit starting on top of the taillight panel. The worst of the rust was the small rust hole that was in the wiper cowling area, and whenever I would wash the car, I would find my passenger footwell get wet. So I sealed this off with some silicone, and that held up over the years to let me go ahead and drive and enjoy the car without worry. I knew I was going to take it apart at some point, I just didn't know when. The battery box also showed a little bit of rust, but it was nothing serious, and there was no rust through in this area. The previously mentioned fender bender that it had been in, the body and Bondo filler was starting to crack out and look a little bit on the terrible side if you got up close enough to see where they would kind of re-groove where the body lines were. You could kind of see sanding scratches underneath that paint from the repair as well. And the passenger side of the bumper had a slight bend in it from the same wreck. Also, I had damaged my roof by pushing off on it to open my garage door after my garage door opener failed once, and I had to squeeze between both my cars and push myself up to release the latch. I knew every single little flaw this car had inside and out, and knew at some point, someday, I was going to do a complete ground-up restoration on it. I just didn't know exactly when. I had been planning for this in the background and saving for years, as well as accruing a part or two. What I didn't plan for was January 12th, 2013. It was a Saturday that I had driven my Z to work because it was a beautiful day, and I drove that car most of the time when the weather was perfect. On the way home from work, the crank pulley bolt was loose and it caused the crankshaft pulley to wobble, and it came apart and it damaged the radiator and the cooling fan. This caused the engine to overheat badly, but I was able to get it home no problem, and once I parked it in the garage, that was the very last time the car would ever run. I had figured at this point this is the perfect time to take the car apart and give it the restoration it truly deserves. Between the time that the car had stopped running and the time I took the car apart, I had accrued some dry ice. I decided I'll try to get the dents out of the roof before it goes to the body shop, and this method proved not to do a dang freaking thing except melt. How disappointing was that? Between January and April of 13, I cleaned the garage out as best as I can, moving all unnecessary and rarely used items into my shed to make room to pull the Z apart. I also moved the Sentra off to the side by putting it up on dollies and rolling it as close as I can against the wall, as I wasn't driving the car anyway, and I was going to need the extra space. I gathered some items together that I thought I would need during the teardown process to help label it, document, and bag and tag the items, as well as a whiteboard I put up on the wall to outline the things I need to keep track of and do next. The actual teardown process began on April 7th, 2013. I disconnected the negative battery cable and started pulling the car apart, starting from the inside mostly. I went ahead and took apart the interior. I gutted the doors after that, and then after I got the interior gutted, I took the lights and trim and bumpers off the outside of the car. Once I had everything out of the interior and all the lights and wiring out of it, I decided to take all of the sound insulation out by using a hammer and a scraper. I got all the sound insulation out because I didn't want the body shop to have to deal with it, and that would save me money during their process. Once all that was done, it was time to take all the mechanicals out of the car. I dropped out the exhaust, the transmission, the rear differential and suspension, took the engine out of the car, took the front suspension out of the car. I rounded up all the really big items like the drivetrain and suspension and diff, and I put all of that in the shed to keep it out of the way. The garage had pretty much everything else in it. The brake lines and fuel lines and emergency brake cables and all the little leftover things were removed from the body shell, and then I started taking off the undercoating that was underneath the car. This process took several months, and I used different things like a Harbor Freight scraper, and I used oven cleaner to help soften it to get it off easier. And eventually, I wind up using a wire wheel to help get the rest of it off once I got the majority of it off. The wire wheel cleaned up the rest and got it down to bare metal. Once it was down to bare metal, I had applied a coating to it to keep it from flash rusting. Once all the wheel wells were done, I had obtained a chassis rotisserie and put the car on it so that I could flip it over and get to the underside much easier to remove the rest of the undercoating. This made the job so much easier, but it was kind of a mess too, so I had to put up a temporary barrier between our walkway and the garage to keep the mess on the one side. This method actually worked really well and made the job so much easier. And when I finally got a Burns-O-Matic propane torch and used the scraper, I was able to really quickly remove both layers of the thick undercoating. And then I used a wire wheel to clean up the remaining bits. The spare tire area was probably the most difficult to clean underneath the car. Once all of the undercoating was removed from the underside of the car and all of the wheel wells and everything, it was time to build a transport dolly to transport the body of the car to the body shop I pick. I sketched out a design on paper and obtained the materials I needed, and with the help of a good friend, Dave, I was able to put together a body dolly that would move that thing around no problem. Once that was done, I was securing a few new pieces for the car, like a passenger side fender straight from Nissan and a new lower valance piece, as well as a BRE chin spoiler kit for the car. These were installed and test fit at this period of time. And then I also sourced a frame rail kit that went all the way to the rear of the car, as well as a couple of pieces that stiffened up not just the back part of the car or tied the front frame rail to the back of the car, but also strengthened up the front area where the new sway bars would eventually be. All the new pieces were put inside the car and the car was covered up. It sat on the dolly in my garage at this point for a few months. I took pictures and made detailed notes and checked out different body shops in the area until I could find the body shop that was eventually going to take it on, and then I had to wait my turn. This process took a few months. Once the body shop was finally selected, the owner of the body shop came and picked my car up and took it off to the shop. I had to wait about 6 months to get in. Once the car was gone, I was left with a garage filled with a bunch of parts and a little bit of working room. So I decided to take on a few jobs while the body was gone that I could do myself, like straightening out and polishing the stainless steel trim that goes around the edges of the windows. I reshaped some dents out of the metal and got everything straight and polished, and I'm very pleased at the results. The stainless trim that goes around the windshield and the back window glass turned out really amazing. So after I had gotten it all cleaned up, I put protective tape all over it and set it off to the side to keep it from getting damaged until I was ready to put it back on the car. Next up, I decided to get an Eastwood glass polishing kit and try to polish the windshield. It had some bad scraping from old worn windshield wiper blades over the years and road debris and sand and so forth. So I wanted to polish it out and make the windshield look good as new. I was somewhat successful in this process. I tried and tried and tried and tried over many weeks to try to get the windshield to polish out. And at the end of the day, I don't think it turned out super great. And I may wind up having to either have a professional finish the job or just source a new windshield altogether. While I was doing that, the car was at the body shop being stripped down. All of the body filler and old paint were taken off in the stages using grinding discs, and then eventually we moved on to media blasting once all that was done. I had every single nook and cranny media blasted in that car and all of the seam sealer dug out from all the seams. Underneath the taillight panel, you could see the rust that was starting to grow underneath all of the factory body seam sealer and paint. This was going to have to be dealt with later. The media blasting process continued on the inside of the car as well, so there is zero chance that we leave any stone unturned in the process of this body's reconditioning. Media blasting took a few months to get all the parts done, but once it was done, any of the areas of concern were marked, and then the car was wheeled inside the shop and painted in a epoxy primer from top to bottom, inside and out, to keep anything from flash rusting and to protect the car during the next phase. The next phase was going to be rust repair, and it started with the taillight panels. Once all the spot welds were removed, the taillight panel piece was lifted and all of the rust was addressed. Some new metal was required, not much. A lot of it was just blasting out any of the rust that was growing inside there. And then it was all welded back together after being fully primered and never to rust again. I also had the holes in the firewall filled for the AC that was in the car, the aftermarket AC, and then the repairs began on the wiper cowl area. The wiper cowl area was fully addressed, and then the frame rails were done next. And then also the quarter panels where the rust was and it had perforated through, all of that metal was cut out. New metal was fabricated and put into place. The new frame rail sections went on, and then after all the metal work was done on the car, it was straightened out with some filler, minor skim coats of filler, by the way. And every single seam in the car was self-leveled, seam sealed. The final piece of metal work that needed to be done was the passenger door, which had been damaged during the wreck that the car was in previous in its life. That part of the door was oil canning and could not be fixed without either a ton of filler or very satisfactorily at all. So the decision was made to make a pattern off the driver's side door panel and fabricate a brand new door skin. The original door skin was removed, everything was media blasted and coated in epoxy primer. Then the door skin was grafted onto a section of the original door skin and metal finished to blend in. Once this was done, the door pretty much looked like it was never touched ever in its life, was straight as an arrow, and was ready to be epoxy primered and hung back on the car for the next phase of the bodywork. There it is in epoxy primer. Like I had mentioned, self-leveling body sealer was applied to every single seam there was. Then the underside of the car was texture coated, as in, like what the factory would have done, and painted in the original body color. The inside of the car was seam sealed before being painted as well. The engine bay was the next piece of the car to get paint applied to it. Then after that, everything was taped off and it was time to perfect the outside body lines and get the outside of the car ready for paint. The car was coated with a skim coat of filler and everything was block sanded multiple times and used a high build primer to help get all of the imperfections out of the car and straighten up all of the lines and make sure all the body lines were nice and crisp instead of being dulled out. This applies everywhere, even where the bumpers cover up. The car turned out laser straight, and once that was all done and all the primer work was done, everything was put into a sealer. And finally, the color could start being laid down on the outside parts of the car, starting with areas like the wiper cowl area and the back sides of the fenders and the jam work that had to be done where the fenders mount to, as well as the door jambs and the rear hatch jamb area. The backs of the fenders were in texture coat also to protect them from road elements. After all the jam work was done, it was finally time to hang the panels one last time and do the actual paint color on the outside of the car. Once this process was done, it was 5 coats of color and 5 coats of high solids clear coat that was applied to the car. Once the body of the car was finally in paint, the last pieces of the puzzle was the grille, chin spoiler, and taillight panel coverings. Those were all to be painted the same color to match. By this point in time, the car had been at the body shop for about 4 years, and I had run out of money again. And it was time to bring the car home. So, on June 8th, 2019, the car was loaded into a carrier and brought to my house. Once the car was at the house, it was unloaded and put in my garage, and then I loaded it up full of all of the parts that I had loose taken out of it and in boxes, such as the dash, seats, and all the other boxes of pieces. I covered the car up really good and stuffed it off into the corner because it was going to be quite a while before I could even get to it again. I had to build up all my funding all over again, and I wanted to make sure the car was as protected as possible during this phase. The car would sit like this for nearly 4 years until April 22nd, 2023, when I finally uncovered the car for the first time in, well, almost 4 years. I was able to uncover it and bury and dig out all of the parts and pieces I had inside the car because I was going to need to lay everything out for the next phase. Seeing the car uncovered for the first time in almost 4 years was a real experience. I had forgotten just how good of a job that body shop had done. Every single nook, cranny, square inch of that car has been covered in paint. That car should never, ever rust ever again, which was the whole goal of that whole thing. Once I had gotten all the boxes out of the car, I sorted through them and removed all of the items of hardware and bracketry and whatever needs to be plated, placed them onto the same table that I tried to polish the windshield on from years earlier, and sorted them out. And this is where we are today. And to give you a brief insight onto the direction I'm taking this car, I am taking inspiration from the Z432 model, which was a Japanese market-only car, and I'm going to mix it with some elements from the US model and Brock Racing Enterprises, such as the BRE chin spoiler. But it is clear from the photos that I am showing you that there is definitely going to be some Z432 influence on my car. If you're curious about the other things I'm going to do with the car, you can hit me up in the comments section. Let me know if you're interested in seeing anything else. Now that we're caught up and you've seen what journey got me here to this point, now let me tell you what's ahead. Next, I got to get all of this sent out and plated. It's proper plating, whether it's the whitish blue type of plating or the yellow type of zinc plating. This is the next step. Once I get all the hardware back, the fun really begins. That's when I start ordering things like brake lines and fuel lines and suspension bits, brakes, wheels, tires, etc. The very last part of this build is going to be the drivetrain. And I'm going to do it that way so that I don't put it together and then let it sit for way too long. The seals get all dried out and then it starts leaking when I finally get the thing running. I'm not going to deal with any of that mess. I've learned a lot from watching other people. So, I hope that you'll join me on this journey. If you would like to, like and subscribe. That way you get updates whenever I come out with a new video. I don't think they'll be very frequently, at least not in the beginning, because there's a lot of tedious, boring work. And I'll probably video some of it, but not all of it, because really, who wants to see me sorting hardware for hours on end? Nobody. Unless you do, and then, of course, you'd put it down in the comments and let me know. But hey, anyway, I thank you so much for stopping by my YouTube channel. I hope you found it somewhat informative and at least entertaining. And stop back by periodically and check out to see if I have a new video. Thanks for watching.